Welcome back. How long have you been watching my channel? Let me know below.
Thanksgiving always had that bitter edge for me, like a slice of pie served just a little too cold, or a smile from someone who's just about done pretending. I wasn't dreading it, not exactly, but let's just say I wasn't counting the days. My mother had a way of turning holidays into performance reviews, where everyone was measured, graded, and quietly reminded of their place. My brother Jason, he was always the golden boy. Even when he'd show up late, forget gifts, or bring a new girlfriend every other year, he was somehow still so thoughtful, so busy with his career, or just tired from working so hard. Me, I could bring a damn casserole, a smile, and a promotion, and she'd still find something to tilt her head at and say, "You look tired, sweetie. Are you okay?" That morning, as I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home, a too large, too clean colonial that reeked of staged nostalgia, I felt that familiar tightness settle behind my ribs. I took a breath, glanced at the tiny velvet box hidden deep in my coat pocket, and reminded myself this year it was going to be different. Because I was different. And even if no one else noticed, I'd made peace with who I was and who I loved, mostly. The kitchen was already alive with the smell of turkey, cloves, cinnamon, those warm scents that masked the tension in the air. My mother turned just as I stepped in, all apron and mascara, and greeted me with that performative joy she saves for photos and social media captions. Jason was already there, carving something way too early, and his wife Kelsey perched on a stool like the goddamn cover of a lifestyle magazine. She had that effortless beauty that people like my mother eat up. Smooth blowout, pearl studs, those floaty neutrals that scream wealth without trying. And don't get me wrong, she's nice enough. Too nice, actually. That kind of careful, calculated sweetness that tells you she's had practice. "Darling, you remember Kelsey," my mother chirped as she handed me a mimosa that somehow already had lipstick on the rim. "She's just radiant today. That blouse is so elegant. I swear she always looks like she stepped out of a catalog. So classy." And then, because she can never stop at a compliment without a jab, she chuckled and turned toward me. "When will you find someone like that?" It was light, a joke, a nothing kind of comment, but it landed like a gut punch all the same. Not because it hurt exactly, but because it was expected. And I was so damn tired of expecting it. I didn't say anything right away. I just reached into my pocket, pulled out the box, and flipped it open slowly, watching her face shift as she caught the glint. A simple, elegant ring, white gold, one stone, no frills, but meaningful, real. "That's funny," I said, my voice just low enough to carry the weight it needed. "Because that's exactly what my fiancé said about me yesterday." The silence was almost theatrical. Jason froze. Kelsey's smile twitched. And my mother, her face did something strange, like she couldn't decide whether to frown or fake a smile, so she landed somewhere awkward in between, like someone trying to hold in a sneeze during church. She blinked too quickly, looked at the ring, then at me, then at the ring again. "Oh," she said, "just that. Nothing more." And it hit me then, not just that she was surprised, but that she wasn't surprised for the right reason. Not "my daughter is engaged," not "this is joyful news," but something else, something wary. Like she was doing math in her head, trying to calculate how this affected her image, her narrative, her careful little world. Jason recovered first. He clapped me on the back, too hard, like always, and gave a loud, "Damn, sis, that's awesome! When's the wedding?" I smottled, but it didn't quite reach my eyes. "Soon," I said. "But let's get through this dinner first, yeah?" Kelsey raised her glass in a toast, all grace and control. "To new beginnings," she said, which felt oddly loaded. Her eyes flicked to the ring, then to my mother. "Congratulations." And just like that, the room shifted, not with joy, but with a new kind of tension, one that didn't come from old habits or passive digs. This one felt fresh, sharp, like the first drop of blood after a clean cut. I knew then, Kelsey knew something. Maybe not everything, but enough to make her voice carry that strange edge. And my mother, she wasn't just uncomfortable. She was afraid. That was the moment I realized. This wasn't just my moment. It was the first domino. But before we go on, let me ask you something. Have you ever had that second, that exact breath where someone's face changes so subtly, you know they've been hiding something for years? What did you do with that moment? Did you press in or smile and let it pass? Because I didn't let it pass. And that Thanksgiving, it wasn't about gratitude. It was about truth. And it had claws. The rest of the afternoon unfolded like a play, where the actors knew their lines too well, each movement rehearsed, every smile carved with just enough precision to hold up the illusion of a perfect family gathering, though the air between us had shifted in a way that only I seemed fully aware of. My mother floated through the rooms like a hostess trying to control a dinner party that was rapidly slipping from her grip, her tone just slightly higher than normal, her laugh a little too bright, her glances toward me laced with a tightness that wasn't there an hour ago, as if the very presence of that ring on my finger had cracked something fragile beneath her polished exterior. Jason, oblivious as always or simply choosing to be, kept talking about his new project at the firm. Something about expansion into a new market, the kind of jargon-heavy nonsense our mother loved to pretend she understood, nodding along as if she were on the board of directors. Kelsey stayed mostly quiet, sipping from her wine glass with a grace that could have passed for disinterest if I hadn't caught that glance again. That quick, calculating flick of the eyes toward my hand when she thought no one was watching. The kind of look that wasn't about admiration but inventory, like she was placing the moment in a larger context I hadn't yet seen. We all sat down around the long wooden table, the one my father had built when I was a kid, though he hadn't been mentioned once all day, as if saying his name might cause the walls to remember how it used to feel. When he was here and unafraid to call out my mother's little cruelties for what they were. The food was beautiful, it always was. Presentation over authenticity, garnishes over warmth. But the tension in my stomach had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the silence that followed Kelsey's next sentence. "So, Julia, huh?" she said, lifting her fork slowly, her eyes not on me, but on my mother. I think I might know her. She didn't used to live in Boston, did she? There was nothing immediately suspicious in the way she said it. No malice, no sarcasm, but the words hit me with the soft thud of a body falling onto carpet. I stared at her, my fork halfway to my mouth, my heartbeat suddenly much too loud in my ears. I had never told anyone in this room that Julia had lived in Boston, because she hadn't. Not to my knowledge. My mother was the first to respond, but her reaction was too slow, too careful. "Boston," she echoed, frowning. "Oh, I didn't think Julia had any ties there. Right, sweetheart." There it was, that subtle shift again. She was fishing, playing dumb in a way that told me she wasn't surprised by the question, just irritated that it had surfaced at all. I swallowed slowly and set my fork down. "No," I said, not taking my eyes off Kelsey. "She's never lived there. Why do you uike?" Kelsey blinked, her smile soft but unreadable. "Oh, must be a different Julia then. I met someone at a fundraiser a few years back. Looked a lot like her. It's probably nothing." But it wasn't nothing. The room had gone quiet in that way it only does when everyone knows not to push further, and that silence spoke louder than any denial. I studied my mother's face, tight, guarded, lips pressed thin, and in that moment, I knew that there was something more under the surface, something that had been there for years, and I had just accidentally found the first thread. After dinner, while Jason helped clean up and my mother disappeared into the living room, I made my way to the basement, a place I hadn't gone in years, filled with storage boxes and the detritus of a family that had stopped pretending to care about memories once Instagram made nostalgia performative. I told myself I was just looking for a quiet place to breathe, but something deeper pulled me there, a need to dig, to feel the walls of this place that had shaped me. That's when I saw it. The old cedar chest pushed back behind a rack of coats and an unused exercise bike. I knelt down, brushing away dust, and opened the heavy lid. Inside, old photo albums, letters, cards, some mine, some Jason's, but beneath them, a folder. Cream-colored, thick, with my mother's handwriting on the tab. Jason, personal. My hand moved without thinking. I opened it. Inside were letters, handwritten, dated 2 years before Jason even introduced Kelsey to us officially. They were from Kelsey, and they weren't addressed to Jason. They were addressed to my mother. Dear Margaret, one began. Thank you for taking the time to meet with me. I really appreciate your advice about Julia, and I understand now why it's best if Jason and I move forward without complications from the past. I stared at the page, heart thudding. Julia. My Julia. The same Julia I had met a year later, at a conference in Portland. The same one who had told me she had only ever dated one person before me. A man who broke her heart and never made her feel like she was enough. She had never named him. I never pushed. But now my skin crawled with the realization. Jason had dated Julia, and my mother had known, she had known, before I even met her. Before Julia and I ever exchanged numbers. And she said nothing, not when I brought her home, not when I told her we were serious, not even today, when I said we were getting married. I stood in that dim basement for a long time, the hum of the old freezer, the only sound in the room. My hands were trembling slightly, the edges of the paper soft and worn from being handled. I couldn't decide if I felt sick, or cold, or just angry enough to burn a hole through the floor. And somewhere upstairs, I heard laughter, my mother's voice, Kelsey's light chuckle. They were still playing the game, but I had just changed the rules. When I climbed the creaking basement stairs back into the kitchen, my fingers still slightly shaking from the letter I had just read, the world around me had already returned to its perfectly controlled, surgically sterilized version of normal. A dozen voices murmuring over pie and coffee, the clinking of utensils, and that endless orchestration of false comfort that always made holidays in our house feel like theater with the heat turned too high and the windows nailed shut. No one noticed the shift in my posture, or the weight in my eyes, or maybe they noticed and chose to ignore it, because that's what we did in my family. Avoid anything that might make someone uncomfortable, unless, of course, that someone was me. My mother was pouring decaf into porcelain cups with the precision of a woman who had spent her entire life convincing herself that control was love. And across the table, Jason leaned in close to Kelsey, whispering something that made her laugh, just a little too loudly, the sound tinkling across the room like glass about to shatter. I stood in the doorway for a moment, letting the frame hold me upright, watching them all like they were strangers wearing familiar faces, and something deep in me, the part that had always kept my mouth shut, that had smiled through every backhanded compliment and every dismissal, began to fray in slow, quiet threads. I moved to the dining table, sat down with deliberate calm, and lifted my glass, letting the light catch the ring again. Kelsey's eyes went straight to it, and I caught the corner of her mouth twitch just slightly, like she was suppressing the urge to speak before I did. I beat her to it. "You know," I said, swirling the wine in my glass, as though I were simply musing out loud, and not sharpening a blade beneath the table. "It's strange, but I was down in the basement just now, looking for an old album, and I came across some letters." My mother paused mid-reach for a napkin, her fingers freezing in midair, for half a second before she recovered, blinking slowly. "Oh, what kind of letters?" I smiled, soft and slow, the kind of smile that says, "I'm done pretending to play nice." "Personal ones. From Kelsey, actually, to you. From before you and Jason were even a thing." Jason looked up then, confused, the way he always looked when real life deviated from the script he'd written in his head. "Wait, what letters?" Kelsey's face didn't move, but I could see it in her eyes. The recognition, the slow calculation, the attempt to assess just how much I had found and how much of it I actually understood. She stayed silent. "They mentioned Julia," I added, the name landing like a thud in the middle of the table, and suddenly the whole room seemed to lean in ever so slightly, like the oxygen itself had shifted in density. Funny, because that's how I met her. Through a conference. A total coincidence. But what are the odds, right? That the woman I'd fall in love with was once involved with my brother? My mother's mouth opened, then closed, and for the first time in years, she looked like she had nothing to say. Not a platitude, not a denial, not even one of those passive-aggressive redirects she loved so much. Just silence. Heavy, loaded silence. I didn't know at first, I continued, my voice even, but no longer soft. Julia never told me. She said there was a man who hurt her deeply, someone she trusted who made her feel like a placeholder. She said he had a family who pretended to accept her, but in reality, judged her every step of the way. She said it made her feel small. Jason turned to our mother then, his face pale, the realization beginning to bloom in his expression. Wait, are you saying that was me? I'm saying, I said slowly, carefully, deliberately, that you dated her, and you knew who she was when I brought her home. But more than that, Mom did too, and neither of you said a word. Jason stared at my mother. You knew? I was protecting this family, she finally said, her voice tight with something that sounded too rehearsed to be regret, and too defensive to be truth. It was complicated. You don't understand. No, I interrupted. Leaning forward now, the fire rising in me finally breaking the surface. You don't understand. You never have. You spent my entire life trying to make me feel like the afterthought, the one who didn't quite fit, the one who was always a little too much or not enough. And when I finally found someone who saw me, really saw me, you kept your mouth shut about something that could have destroyed us, just to preserve your precious image of a perfect family. Kelsey cleared her throat, finally speaking, her voice calm but carefully measured. I didn't know who she was to Jason until after you brought her home, she said. But once I did, your mother told me it would be best to let the past stay buried, that it would only create unnecessary tension, and I listened. I shouldn't have. There was a pause, long, aching, filled with the sound of years collapsing. Why didn't Julia tell me? Jason asked, looking lost for the first time in his life. Because she didn't want to hurt me, I said. She thought maybe it didn't matter, that maybe we could move forward without dragging every ghost to the table. And now you've dragged them all here anyway, my mother muttered. I turned to her then, locking eyes with the woman who had raised me, but never really let me bloom in her presence. No, I said, voice low. You dragged them here. When you made a deal with silence. When you let your son's history hang like a shadow over my future, and never once thought I deserved to know the truth. The room sat in stillness, broken only by the sound of a clock ticking somewhere in the hall. And here's the thing, I added as I stood, pushing my chair back with the soft scrape of wood on tile. You don't get to smile at my ring and ask when I'll find someone like Kelsey, while pretending you weren't part of the reason Julia cried herself to sleep for weeks after meeting this family. You don't get to keep playing innocent when the whole damn show was built on lies. I walked away from the table then, my back straight, heart racing, and the ring on my hand catching the light like a flare thrown across the deck of a sinking ship. Behind me, no one followed, because deep down, they knew. The show was over, and the next act was mine to write. The morning after should have brought quiet, maybe some regret, perhaps even a sliver of remorse. But in that house, apologies were things that happened behind closed doors, if they happened at all. And shame was a garment worn only when no one was looking. When I emerged from the guest bedroom, my old room, stripped now of every trace of the girl who once lived there, except the dent in the door from when I slammed it shut the night I didn't get into Columbia, it was already too late for reconciliation and far too early for redemption. The scent of leftover turkey filled the house, clashing with the faint chemical sweetness of whatever candle my mother had lit to cover the staleness of the air, and the silence that settled between us was not peace, but prelude. My mother sat in the sunroom, one leg crossed tightly over the other, her phone in hand, but not scrolling, just holding it, like a prop, something to keep her hands busy while she rehearsed whatever version of yesterday she would retell to her church friends and garden club women who would never hear the full story. Just a carefully trimmed headline. Family drama at Thanksgiving, but everything's fine now. Jason had gone out early, claiming errands, though I knew it was more about escape than necessity, and Kelsey had chosen to stay, which told me more than anything she'd said the night before, that she knew the storm was still circling, and she wanted to be there when it landed. It was around midday when I decided that enough had been said, and now something needed to be done, not out of spite, but out of a deeper need for balance. A correction of the scales that had been tilted against me for so long, I had almost forgotten how it felt to stand on even ground. I didn't plan it exactly. I didn't need to. The truth had already done most of the work. I only had to let it speak, loudly, clearly, and in front of the right audience. They were all gathered in the living room again, drinks in hand, the television flickering with some Hallmark holiday movie no one was actually watching. A scene so painfully artificial it made my teeth hurt. I stepped into the room slowly, holding the remote like a gavel, and when I spoke, it was not with anger, but with a kind of calm I hadn't known I was capable of. I want to show you something, I said, not asking, just stating, and they looked up, surprised, but silent. With one click, I replaced the sentimental snowstorm scene on the screen with a video. Something simple, something short, but devastating in its quiet certainty. It was a clip Julia had sent me long ago, a random moment she'd captured without much thought. Jason, younger by a few years, laughing on a bench in Boston Common, arm draped casually over her shoulder. They weren't kissing, they weren't saying anything profound, but the intimacy was unmistakable. It was real. It was undeniable. And most damning of all, it was time-stamped. 2021, I said softly, turning toward my brother, who stared at the screen like it was a ghost. A year before I met her. A year before either of you said anything. And this? I nodded toward my mother, who now sat motionless, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face drained of its usual composure. This is what you asked Kelsey to help you erase. Jason opened his mouth to speak, but I lifted a hand, silencing him without a word. You didn't just keep it from me. You let me walk into that history blind. Let me build a life with someone whose pain you all participated in, and then had the audacity to smile when I said we were getting married, like you hadn't already written her out of the family story. The room was so quiet I could hear the furnace humming from the basement, and for a second, I thought my mother might actually apologize, might finally lower her guard and admit that her obsession with appearances had cost her something real, but instead, she did what she always did. She pivoted. I only wanted what was best for you, she said, her voice brittle, like old lace. Julia wasn't right for this family, not after everything. That wasn't your choice, I said, stepping forward now, feeling the full weight of every year I had swallowed my voice in her presence. You don't get to decide who's right for me based on your broken compass, and you certainly don't get to build a lie on top of a truth and then expect me to keep living in it. Kelsey, who had remained silent until now, cleared her throat, her voice steady, deliberate. I told Margaret what I knew, but I should have told you too. I thought I was being loyal to the family. I thought I was helping, but I see now I was protecting the wrong people. Jason finally spoke, his voice low and unsure. I never thought it mattered anymore. Julia and I, we weren't anything serious. I didn't think it would affect you. You didn't think, I said, and the simplicity of the words made them land harder than any accusation. Then before they could respond, I delivered the final blow, not with malice, but with cold, clear finality. You want to know the best part? I said, reaching into my pocket. We're already married, Julia and I. We eloped last month. No speeches, no photos, no perfect table settings. My mother's face collapsed then, not in grief, but in offense, the kind of wounded pride that comes from losing control over something she believed was hers to curate. And I didn't tell you, I added, because I wanted one thing, just one, that wasn't filtered through your judgment, your approval, or your rules. I set the marriage license down on the coffee table like a trophy, then turned and walked out. Not in rage, not in triumph, but with the calm of someone who has nothing left to fear, from the people who once held her silence hostage. Behind me, no one said a word, because they all knew. The meal was over, and the main course had been served cold. The drive home should have been quiet, reflective even, the kind of soft decompression that follows emotional eruption, but instead it felt like I was gliding through a strange kind of clarity, a space where the anger had burned clean through the noise, leaving behind something sharper, more precise, almost surgical in its stillness. The late November sky stretched above me in a pale gray sheet, cold light settling over the highway like ash, and with every passing mile, the weight that had sat lodged in my chest for years, disappointment, rejection, that aching hunger to be seen without conditions, finally began to loosen its grip. Not all at once, not completely, but enough for me to notice the way my lungs expanded deeper, fuller, as if I had only just remembered how to breathe. Julia waited for me at the apartment, curled up on the sofa in one of my old college sweatshirts, legs tucked under her, eyes calm but alert. In that way she always was when she sensed I had returned from somewhere, not just physical, but emotional, the kind of place where you have to fight your way back out with words you're not sure will make it all the way to your lips. She didn't speak right away, didn't rush me with questions or comfort, just looked at me with that steady gaze that had first pulled me in, that quiet understanding that told me she knew this wasn't about revenge or performance or even confrontation anymore. It was about letting go of the illusion that I owed anyone an explanation for becoming someone they never had the imagination to expect. I sank down beside her, not with exhaustion, but with the kind of relief that comes after a final exhale, after holding your breath in a room full of people who loved you in all the wrong ways. I told her everything then, not just the facts, what had been said, what had been shown, the video, the license, but the deeper, rawer layers. The look in my mother's eyes when she realized she had lost control of the story. The way Jason stared at me not like a sister, but like someone who had upended a fragile ecosystem he thought would never be disturbed. And the silence that followed me as I left the house that, despite being the site of every birthday, every Christmas morning, every scraped knee and slammed door, had never really been home. Julia didn't say much, just took my hand and held it between hers, tracing slow circles against my palm like she was reminding me I had a right to peace, a right to truth, even when it came at the cost of comfort. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't been willing to admit before. She had known the storm was coming, maybe not all the details, but the shape of it, the inevitability of it. She had carried the guilt of her past with my brother not because she believed it defined her, but because she understood how deeply my family had embedded itself into my sense of self-worth. How thoroughly I had been conditioned to seek approval from people who measured love in obedience and silence. Later that evening, as we sat at the kitchen table eating leftover pumpkin pie straight from the pan, something absurdly domestic and grounding after the drama of the previous day, Julia finally spoke the words that hovered on the edge of every question I hadn't asked. "You know," she said, her voice quiet, almost tentative, "if you ever want to talk about what this means for them, for your relationship with them, I'll listen, but I won't push. You don't owe anyone anything, not even closure." And she was right. That was the strange final liberation. Understanding that I didn't have to fix what they had broken, didn't have to keep making space in my life for people who only ever wanted to reshape me into something more palatable, more acceptable, more like the woman they had imagined, but never quite believed I could be. For years, I had mistaken proximity for closeness, had convinced myself that showing up to family dinners, answering texts, biting my tongue through offhand comments, meant I was still part of something meaningful. But all it really meant was that I had let them write the rules, and now I was done playing their game. In the weeks that followed, I didn't hear from my mother, not a call, not a message, Not even one of her infamous guilt-laced holiday cards with the tiny cursive note about how the season makes us reflect on what really matters. Jason sent a single text, "Can we talk?" To which I replied, "Maybe, but not yet." Kelsey, oddly enough, sent me a short but sincere message apologizing again, not just for her part in the silence, but for failing to recognize earlier the kind of woman my mother had always been when no one was watching. It didn't make us friends, but it made her human in a way I hadn't expected, and that mattered more than I would have admitted aloud. As for my mother, maybe she would never come around. Maybe she would rewrite the whole Thanksgiving in her mind as some betrayal she didn't deserve, clinging to the belief that dignity came from control, not truth. Or maybe, in some quiet moment she'd never tell anyone about, she'd look at a photo of me and Julia and wonder what it would have cost to just be happy for me. I didn't know, and for the first time in my life, I didn't need to know. What I did know was this: the past is never truly silent. It waits, tucked between old letters stitched into offhand comments, hidden in family photos where someone's smile doesn't quite reach their eyes. And sometimes, when you're finally ready to hear it, it tells you not just where you came from, but where you're no longer willing to stay. We never did throw a big wedding. No white dress, no vows under fairy lights, no dance floor full of forced smiles and distant cousins. But we did take a weekend in the mountains, just the two of us, and we said our promises with snow outside the window and coffee between us. And for once, I felt like I wasn't performing. I was just being. And in the quiet that followed, I finally felt it. Not forgiveness, not closure, but something better: freedom.